He was once beloved by the people of Rome, a young emperor who promised to restore the greatness of the empire. But just 4 years into his reign, Caligula transformed into one of the most notorious figures in history. A man who believed he was a god, he ruled with absolute terror, indulging in bizarre and cruel acts that would turn Rome into a living hell. How did this once promising emperor descend into madness, and what drove him to commit unspeakable atrocities? Join us as we uncover the shocking story of Caligula the emperor who shattered the very foundations of Rome. Manius Aurelius Caligula was born in 12 AD, into a world of political intrigue and instability. His father Germanicus was a popular and respected general of the Roman Empire, beloved by the people and admired for his military prowess. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of Emperor Augustus, giving Caligula a prestigious lineage that set the stage for his future as a potential heir to the imperial throne. However, tragedy struck early in Caligula's life. At just 7 years old, Caligula's father Germanicus died under mysterious circumstances. His death, though officially attributed to natural causes, was believed by many to be the result of poisoning possibly orchestrated by Tiberius, the then emperor of Rome, who had become increasingly paranoid and suspicious of potential threats to his power. After his father's death, Caligula, along with his mother and siblings, was left to fend for themselves in a Roman political climate that was growing more dangerous by the day. Caligula's early life was filled with hardship and loss. His mother Agrippina was imprisoned by Tiberius, and his family was embroiled in a series of political purges. His childhood was marred by the death of his relatives, many of whom were executed or exiled. Caligula, once surrounded by the wealth and influence of his family, was left vulnerable and isolated. However, he was also shaped by the harsh lessons of survival in a cutthroat political environment. It was during these formative years that Caligula developed a sense of fearlessness and ambition, traits that would define his future reign as emperor. In 31 AD, after Tiberius's death, Caligula, then in his late 20s, was named emperor. Initially, his ascension to the throne seemed like a breath of fresh air for Rome. After years of suffering under Tiberius's oppressive rule, the people hoped that Caligula would be different. At first, he was everything the Romans had hoped for. He freed prisoners, recalled exiles, and made grand promises of reform. His reign began with a wave of popular support, and it seemed that he would bring a new era of prosperity and stability to the empire. However, the early months of Caligula's rule quickly gave way to signs of erratic behavior. What had initially been seen as a period of rejuvenation soon began to unravel as the emperor started to show a darker side. Caligula's behavior shifted dramatically after a brief but serious illness that left him bedridden for several months. The recovery period that followed marked a turning point in his reign that would take the empire into a terrifying new era. As the months passed, Caligula's rule grew more unpredictable and more tyrannical. What started as an odd quirk soon escalated into acts of cruelty and madness. The same emperor who had once been embraced by the Roman people now sought to control them through fear. His desire for absolute power led him to do the unthinkable. He declared himself a living god, ordering the construction of a temple to house a massive statue of himself, which he insisted be worshipped. This marked the beginning of a reign characterized by cruelty, paranoia, and a complete disregard for human life. Caligula's madness manifested in various ways. She engaged in bizarre public displays, including forcing the Senate to worship him as a divine being, and he even appointed his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a consul. This was not just an eccentric gesture. Caligula's actions were meant to demonstrate his absolute power over the empire and mock the Senate and the political structures that had once governed Rome. His disregard for tradition and his growing obsession with divinity alienated many of his supporters, and his reign became increasingly unpopular among the elite of Rome. Caligula's insanity also manifested in a reign marked by extravagant spending, public executions, and violent purges. He began to execute those who displeased him, and many in the Senate lived in constant fear of being accused of treason. His acts of cruelty weren't just limited to his political rivals. He regularly humiliated the Roman aristocracy and created a reign of terror where no one was safe from his whims. Caligula had gone from being a promising emperor to a ruthless tyrant, but his descent into madness was far from complete. His reign would soon reach new heights of depravity, as the empire would face its most terrifying moments. What drove him to commit unspeakable acts? And what could possibly stop the emperor who had everything and yet lost his sanity? As Caligula settled into his reign, the seeds of tyranny began to sprout, and what had initially been seen as eccentricities quickly escalated into something far more sinister. His early acts of cruelty shocked the Roman populace, but his true madness unfolded with the unrelenting force of a storm. The emperor, once seen as a savior after the death of Tiberius, now began to show his true colors that were drenched in blood and madness. One of the most notable early signs of Caligula's insanity was his obsession with power. He began to view himself as a god, demanding that the people of Rome worship him. He ordered that his statues be placed in temples, and even in Jewish synagogues, something that would have been considered an outrageous affront to many. The Senate, once a powerful body, found itself marginalized as Caligula consolidated all authority into his hands. The emperor's ego grew as he surrounded himself with sycophants, further isolating himself from the very people he was supposed to serve. His arrogance became legendary, and his belief in his own divinity grew stronger with each passing day. By 39 AD, Caligula's cruelty was no longer limited to his political opponents. He began to target those closest to him, friends, family, and even those who had once supported his rise to power. His first major act of terror came when he ordered the execution of his own cousin Tiberius Gemellus, and exiled his mother-in-law, the influential Agrippina the Younger. The violence did not stop there. Caligula's paranoia and jealousy led him to order the executions of other prominent figures, including members of his own family. He even went as far as accusing his sisters of adultery and having them executed, fearing that their influence would undermine his absolute rule. While Caligula's behavior was shocking, his cruelty toward his closest allies was just the beginning. His thirst for absolute control grew, and the people of Rome became increasingly terrified of his unpredictable nature. The emperor's psychological instability reached new heights as he became obsessed with the idea of omnipotence. His lavish spending spiraled out of control, with his extravagant building projects and massive expenditures draining the imperial treasury. He ordered the construction of palaces, temples, and theaters, monuments to his power that symbolized the emperor's descent into madness. One of the most notorious acts that Caligula engaged in during this period was his obsession with the military. No longer content with simply ruling from Rome, he decided to embark on a military campaign in Gaul, one that would showcase his supposed divinity to the people. Caligula, in a fit of delusion, claimed that he had been given divine orders to lead an army against Neptune, the sea god. He famously marched his troops to the shores of Gaul and commanded them to collect seashells as spoils of war, a bizarre spectacle that left many soldiers and citizens bewildered. This victory over the sea god was one of the most absurd moments of Caligula's reign, and became a symbol of his unhinged rule. Caligula's madness extended to his personal life as well. His relationships with his sisters, most notably Drusilla, took a dark turn as he became obsessed with them, to the point of engaging in incestuous relationships. Caligula's infatuation with his sisters and his unrestrained desire for power began to dominate his actions. He sought to elevate them to divine status, declaring one of his sisters, Julia Livilla, as a goddess. His sexual exploits were a spectacle in Rome, and the emperor began to flaunt his power by committing acts of sexual debauchery and violence. These actions shocked even his most loyal followers, yet no one dared to challenge his rule. At the same time, Caligula began to openly mock the very institutions that had once held Rome together. He ridiculed the Senate, stripping it of any remaining power, and surrounded himself with flatterers and corrupt officials. The emperor's sense of invincibility grew to the point where he made brazen decisions to humiliate Rome's most respected officials. One of his most infamous acts was appointing his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a consul, a political office that was traditionally held by the Roman elite. The appointment, though often seen as a joke, was a devastating commentary on Caligula's contempt for the Roman political system and his absolute disregard for tradition. he sought to demonstrate his power not just through cruelty, but by rendering the very structures of Roman governance meaningless. Caligula's actions began to reach a fever pitch, and the people of Rome were caught in a wave of terror. The emperor's paranoia made everyone suspect no one was safe from his wrath. Executions were carried out with no trial, and entire families were wiped out at his command. Caligula's brutality was not just about consolidating power. It was about instilling fear in everyone who had ever opposed him. The emperor reveled in his role as a tyrant, no longer caring about the well-being of the empire or its people. His rule had become a theater of cruelty and madness, and the streets of Rome were filled with whispers of rebellion, though no one dared speak too loudly. Caligula had made a mockery of the Roman Empire, reducing its once proud institutions to mere puppets of his own ego. But his reign of terror could not continue indefinitely. His enemies, both inside and outside of his court, began to rally against him. Would his reign of madness end in his downfall? Or would the emperor's insanity lead him to destroy everything and every around him? As Caligula's reign grew ever more tyrannical, the whispers of dissent turned into a loud murmur. For the people of Rome, Caligula's transformation from a promising emperor to a psychotic tyrant was a nightmare. No one was safe from his wrath, and even his closest allies began to see the true nature of his cruelty. As his paranoia deepened, Caligula increasingly relied on a network of informants and spies, ensuring that he could root out any possible threats to his power, but his madness would eventually catch up with him. By 41 AD, Caligula's reign had become unbearable. His cruelty, unpredictability, and unchecked power had created a climate of fear in the empire. Even his once loyal supporters began to grow weary of his madness. The Senate, which Caligula had once sought to humiliate and disempower, began to secretly plot against him. Conspiracies were brewing, and the inevitable clash between the emperor and his own political class was fast approaching. Though Caligula had no shortage of enemies, one of the most significant groups plotting his downfall came from within his own inner circle. Members of the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for guarding the emperor, had grown disillusioned with their emperor's erratic behavior. They saw the emperor as a liability, someone whose madness could bring ruin to the empire. A few senators, feeling powerless and desperate, joined forces with the guards, seeking a way to end Caligula's reign of terror once and for all. In early 41 AD, the conspirators saw their opportunity. They made their move while Caligula was attending a series of performances in a theater. The emperor had recently made a habit of parading through the streets, forcing the people to honor him and view him as a god. On the fateful day, Caligula had been making his usual rounds, enjoying his absolute power and basking in the attention. But the conspirators saw it as the perfect moment to strike. Caligula's assassinators moved quickly. The Praetorian Guard, led by Cassius Caria, a senior officer in the imperial bodyguard, launched a coordinated attack on the emperor. Caligula was stabbed multiple times by Caria and his co-conspirators. Some accounts say that the emperor was caught by surprise, as he was not expecting such an assault from those he had trusted. Others claim that, despite being caught off guard, Caligula fought back, but his assailants overpowered him. The assassination was brutal, and swift. Caligula's life was violently snuffed out. The immediate aftermath of his assassination sent shockwaves through Rome. The city was plunged into chaos as the news of Caligula's death spread. His reign of terror was finally over, but the empire was left to deal with the aftermath of the madness that had gripped it for 4 years. The death of Caligula marked the end of an era, one that had seen the Roman Empire torn apart by the whims of a single insane ruler. However, Caligula's death did not bring immediate peace or stability to Rome. The conspirators who had killed him faced their own challenges. Though Caligula was gone, the political vacuum left in his wake was vast, and the chaos of his rule left many unsure of the empire's future. The Senate, though instrumental in the emperor's death, was cautious about what to do next. With Caligula's body discarded, his reign was over, but the fight for control of Rome was just beginning. Caligula's assassination may have ended his tyrannical rule, but his death was not the final chapter in the story of his empire. As Rome attempted to move forward, questions about his legacy and the trauma caused by his reign lingered. What became of the empire in the wake of such madness? Would the people ever be able to recover from the horrors they had witnessed under his rule? Caligula's death did not immediately restore peace to Rome. In fact, it left the empire in a state of confusion and power struggles. The Senate, which had plotted his assassination, did not immediately take power. Instead, the Roman people who had lived under the reign of a man they had once revered found themselves uncertain of what would come next. Caligula had removed anyone who could challenge him, and many of his enemies were now dead or exiled. His death left a void of leadership, and while some celebrated the end of his tyranny, others feared the potential collapse of the empire. The death of Caligula led to the rise of a new emperor, his uncle, Claudius, who was declared emperor by the Praetorian Guard. Claudius's ascension to the throne, though marked by political intrigue, offered Rome a sense of stability after the chaos of Caligula's reign. Claudius was far more measured and restrained than Caligula, and his reign would see the empire recover from the devastation caused by his predecessor. Caligula's legacy, however, remained a dark stain on the history of Rome. His name became synonymous with cruelty, madness, and tyranny. For centuries, historians would recount the horrors of his rule, and his story would serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power. His reign was one of the darkest periods in Roman history, and his legacy lived on as a symbol of the devastating impact one individual's madness could have on an entire empire. Though his reign was short-lived, Caligula's name would echo through the annals of history. His insanity was studied, his atrocities discussed, and his rise and fall became a tragic example of the dangers of unchecked power. The Roman Empire, though scarred by his reign, would continue on, but the memories of Caligula's madness would forever remain ingrained in the Roman psyche. As we look back on the reign of Caligula, we're left to wonder, what made a ruler who started with such promise descend into madness? How could a man, once seen as the future of Rome, become a living nightmare for the empire he ruled? The story of Caligula is one of both ambition and madness, a lesson in the dangers of absolute power and a stark reminder of the fragility of human nature. After Caligula's death, the Roman Empire was thrust into turmoil. The emperor, whose reign had been marked by terrifying madness and cruelty, had left behind a legacy so deeply rooted in fear and chaos that the shockwaves of his actions reverberated through Rome long after his assassination. Yet, even in death, Caligula's story was not over. His reign had set in motion a series of events that would forever alter the course of Roman history. As the Senate debated who should succeed Caligula, there was one figure who was not initially considered a man who had been largely ignored and underestimated. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, had spent most of his life in the shadow of his more powerful relatives. A man often mocked for his physical disabilities and considered too weak to rule, Claudius was hardly a figure of ambition or intrigue. Yet, in the wake of Caligula's assassination, Claudius found himself declared emperor by the Praetorian Guard, who had seized control of the situation. Claudius's rise to power was, in many ways, a twist of fate. He had been spared the brutality of Caligula's reign. His awkward manner and perceived weaknesses had kept him out of the emperor's cruel schemes. Yet, his ascension to the throne was far from smooth. While many in Rome were still reeling from the horrors of Caligula's reign, others feared that the madness could return with a new emperor. Claudius, however, brought a different approach to governance. Rather than acting impulsively and erratically like Caligula, he worked to stabilize the empire. Despite his initial lack of political experience, Claudius proved to be a shrewd and capable ruler. His first actions as emperor were aimed at restoring order. He ordered an end to the purges, pardoning many of those who had been implicated in Caligula's brutal regime. Claudius also sought to rebuild the empire's finances, which had been drained by Caligula's extravagant spending. He implemented policies that aimed at restoring the Senate's power, but in a way that did not allow them to overstep their boundaries. Claudius's approach to leadership was cautious but effective, and it helped to gradually restore some semblance of stability to a fractured empire. Yet, as Claudius began to assert his authority, the shadow of Caligula's legacy loomed large. The memory of the insane emperor remained fresh in the minds of the Roman people, and the empire's political landscape was still in disarray. But Claudius's reign was not without its own challenges. and his ability to navigate the complex political world of Rome was put to the test. Despite his early successes, Claudius was unable to completely rid the empire of the corruption that had plagued it under Caligula's rule. The Senate, while more subdued, still held significant power and often sought to undermine his decisions. Claudius's greatest test, however, came not from the Senate or the empire's political elite, but from his own family. While Caligula's reign was characterized by violence and excess, Claudius's rule was marred by intrigue and betrayal within his own bloodline. His wife, Messalina, was notorious for her infidelity and manipulations, and it was rumored that she had a hand in several political assassinations. In 48 AD, Messalina's own ambition led to her downfall. She was executed for her involvement in a plot to overthrow Claudius, an event that deeply shook the emperor's trust in those closest to him. Despite his personal losses, Claudius worked to solidify his legacy and continue the empire's expansion. Under his rule, Rome saw significant military victories, including the conquest of Britain in 43 AD, which became one of his greatest achievements. Claudius's administration was marked by improvements in infrastructure, legal reforms, and a greater emphasis on the welfare of the Roman people. However, the empire's recovery from Caligula's reign was slow, and the political instability continued to simmer beneath the surface. Caligula's legacy of madness and violence could not be easily erased, and even Claudius, who had worked hard to rebuild the empire, found himself haunted by the consequences of the previous emperor's actions. The fear and terror that had characterized Caligula's reign left an indelible mark on Rome, and it would take time for the people to recover from the trauma of his rule. But Caligula's influence did not end with his death. His reign had forever changed the way Rome viewed its emperors, and his actions had set a dangerous precedent for future rulers. As Claudius's reign continued, the empire would face new challenges, some directly linked to the madness of Caligula. What would become of the legacy of Caligula in the centuries that followed? Would the horrors of his rule echo throughout Roman history, or would Rome move past the shadow of its most infamous emperor? Though Caligula's immediate reign ended with his assassination, the impact of his madness was felt for generations. The empire, though temporarily stabilized under Claudius, would never truly forget the horrors of Caligula's rule. The insanity and cruelty of the emperor had set a precedent that would haunt the empire for years to come. Even as Rome expanded and thrived under new leadership, the memory of Caligula lingered in the minds of both the Roman people and their rulers. Subsequent emperors, such as Nero, would come to embody the same unpredictability and excess that Caligula had displayed. Nero, like Caligula, would face immense criticism for his erratic behavior, even as his reign was marked by excesses, cruelty, and the destruction of Rome itself. The Roman Empire's history would continue to be shaped by emperors who, like Caligula, were products of the same system that had given birth to one of the most infamous leaders in Roman history. Yet, despite the darkness that Caligula's reign brought to Rome, his story has continued to captivate historians, filmmakers, and storytellers alike. The emperor's descent into madness, his tyrannical rule, and his shocking actions continue to fascinate and terrify. His name has become synonymous with cruelty, insanity, and unchecked power, and his legacy has lived on as a warning of what happens when a ruler is given too much authority. As we look back on Caligula's reign, we are left with many unanswered questions about the true nature of his insanity. Was it a product of his circumstances, or was it inherent in his character? The story of Caligula raises profound questions about power, madness, and the human cost of absolute rule. His legacy, both terrifying and fascinating, is a reminder of the fragile line between greatness and destruction. Caligula's reign left a lasting mark on the Roman Empire, but the question remains, what exactly was his legacy? The madness and excess that defined his rule left Rome reeling, but also forged a path for future emperors who would find themselves haunted by the example he set. While his assassination may have ended the immediate chaos, the echoes of his tyranny reverberated through the empire for decades. After Caligula's death, Rome did recover, but the scars of his reign were not easily erased. Claudius, who succeeded him, worked hard to stabilize the empire, But the damage caused by Caligula's extreme behavior could not be undone overnight. Caligula's violent purges, his lavish spending, and his blatant disregard for Rome's traditions had made Rome a volatile place. His reign had shown the Roman people how quickly an emperor could transform from a benevolent ruler to a tyrant, idea that would continue to plague Roman politics for years to come. The Senate, once a proud and influential body, was weakened beyond repair during Caligula's reign. The emperor had stripped away their power and mocked their authority, leaving them in a subservient position that many in the Senate never recovered from. When Caligula died, the Senate was left with little influence, and the balance of power in Rome was permanently altered. His actions had irrevocably shifted the dynamic between emperor and Senate, creating an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that would persist in the empire for generations. Caligula's reign also left an indelible mark on the psyche of the Roman people. While the Roman Empire would continue to thrive for centuries, the memory of Caligula's madness lived on in stories, warnings, and cautionary tales. The emperor's descent into madness became a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power, and his name became synonymous with tyranny, cruelty, and insanity. His reign demonstrated the terrifying consequences of a ruler who believed they were above reproach, whose ego and ambition led them to destroy everything around them. In the years that followed Caligula's death, many rulers would rise to power who were just as tyrannical and ruthless, though none perhaps as flamboyantly cruel as Caligula himself. Nero, who came to the throne decades after Caligula, would engage in many of the same excesses, squandering the empire's resources, committing atrocities, and engaging in self-indulgent behavior. While Nero's reign was not identical to Caligula's, it was marked by similar patterns of violence, extravagance, and madness. And like Caligula, Nero would leave behind a legacy of devastation and fear. Caligula's reign had also shifted the public perception of Roman emperors. Before him, emperors like Augustus and Tiberius were seen as rulers who upheld the values of the Roman Republic, even if their methods were occasionally harsh. But Caligula shattered that image, showing that an emperor could be both godlike and insane, both a ruler and a tyrant. His reign demonstrated that absolute power, unchecked and uncontested, could transform a once popular leader into a figure of unimaginable cruelty and fear. His insanity became a reflection of the dangers inherent in centralized authority. Caligula's legacy also made its way into Roman art, literature, and culture. His reign, for all its horror, captured the imagination of later generations. Poets, playwrights, and artists chronicled his depravity, crafting stories of his wild excesses, his twisted relationships with family members, and his bizarre orders. His story became a cautionary tale of power gone wrong, a lesson to future rulers about the dangers of tyranny and unchecked ambition. Despite his reign ending in violence and chaos, Caligula's name continued to linger in the Roman consciousness. The idea of the mad emperor became a lasting cultural symbol, used in literature and rhetoric to warn of the dangers of despotism. Caligula's life served as a dark mirror for future rulers, reminding them of the dangers of losing touch with reality and the horrific consequences of pursuing power at any cost. Caligula's madness may have ended with his death, but the empire he left behind was forever changed. His reign had shown the world the extremes of human nature and the corruption that comes with absolute power. His story reminds us that even in the most powerful empires, the potential for madness exists, and the line between godlike authority and terrifying cruelty is thin indeed. His legacy is not just one of horror, but also one of caution, a reminder that the madness of one ruler can change the course of history. As we reflect on Caligula's reign, we must ask ourselves, how did such a man ever rise to power? What allowed Caligula to gain the trust of the people, only to turn that trust into an empire-wide nightmare? The question of what made him go mad remains unanswered, but the story of his reign serves as a timeless lesson. As his madness became legend, so too did the empire he ruled, forever haunted by the ghost of its most insane emperor. Caligula's reign, though short, left a scar on the history of the Roman Empire. From promising beginnings to an unimaginable descent into madness, his story remains one of the most chilling tales of absolute power gone wrong. The emperor who started as a beacon of hope for Rome ultimately turned the empire into a living hell, shaping the future of Roman rule and leaving behind a legacy that continues to fascinate and horrify. As we reflect on the life of Caligula, we are left to wonder, what could have caused a man with so much promise to spiral into insanity? What does his tragic story teach us about power, paranoia, and the human capacity for cruelty? Was Caligula born to madness? Or was his insanity the product of a system that granted him too much power? We'd love to hear your thoughts on the legacy of Caligula. Do you think his madness was inevitable? Or could Rome have avoided the horrors of his rule? What can we learn from the rise and fall of this infamous emperor? Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. If you found this documentary fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who are intrigued by the darkest chapters in history. Caligula may have been a madman, but his story is a stark reminder of the dangers that come with unchecked power. In our next episode, we'll dive into the life of another infamous Roman ruler, Nero. Known for his brutal rule and alleged role in the burning of Rome, Nero's reign was marked by violence, extravagance, and a disregard for the welfare of his people. Was he a madman like Caligula? Or was his reign the result of political ambition gone wrong? Join us as we uncover the fascinating and terrifying history of Nero. Like, subscribe, and click the notification bell to stay updated on our latest episodes.